Hello, thank you for joining us for SMAX user group. I'm Brenda Shakevorkian, your host, and with me I have Jan Stoiber, one of the architects in the R&D team. And Jan is going to cover the integration engine during today's session. If you're here, you're familiar with our SMAX user group. We have 3 types of topics. So today we'll be doing a feature spotlight. We do have the release readiness after each release. And then occasionally we have office hours where we don't have a specific topic, but we use it as an opportunity to exchange information, provide feedback, answer questions. In case you have issues with your audio and you would like to interact with us, you have the option to as well use a telephone number, and you should have all the information in the invite you already have. So for today, we'll just do a quick update on the latest patch releases, and then we'll hand over to Jan. Jan is going to cover with an overview of integration engine with the features, the connectors, and an overview of templates, and then as well actually show live how to build an integration using a generic connector. So for the patches, we do have the first patch released on the 2022-05 release. This is an important patch as it addresses a number of issues, in particular around service level management, as well as some enhancements to SACAM. But as well, it brings in a new capability around converge authorization. We talked about the capability briefly in the release readiness, and then as well in one of the previous sessions. So you can go back and watch the recordings. But with that said, the feature is now available, and if you are using additional capabilities other than SMAX, it's actually quite interesting to enable it, because it will simplify quite a bit the user management and group assignments, role assignments, and so on. And just one more note on the OPB. There is as well in this release comes with a change, right? The patch release allows to configure a proxy for the REST executor to that 0 domain, right? So that's another enhancements been added. So take a look at the release notes. You have all the information there about this patch. And with that, Jan, you can take it from here and talk to us about the integration engine.
Thank you, Brindusa, for the introduction and the handover. Hello, everyone, and today I will give another demo and introduction into our integration engine. And before we do this time a live session configuring integration together, I'd like to give a quick recap of the features we implemented in the various releases. So here's an overview of all the features we have done since 2021-05. And in particular, the latest features we added in the February version of SaaS, which is then also available in the 2022-05 release in the GA version. Like we have a task queue for debugging and monitoring purposes, attachment support. We have an iteration support here, complex JSON support, and also in May release then dev to prod, other improvements. So we added really a bunch of functions here to make our integration engine more stable, give additional features and better capabilities to allow more and better integrations to build. I don't go into details because I really want to spend the most of the time in having this walk through with you and building an integration live. For more details, please look the release readiness webinars, but also have a look in the previous 2 user group sessions about integration engine to get a better overview and more details around those as we have introduced so far. Next, I want to summarize what connectors we offer at the moment in the integration engine. So those are the micro-focus connector, one for SMAX, one for Service Manager, another one for Octane and Quality Center. We also have a connector now for ArcSight SOAR and for operation orchestration. Each connector has a different set of actions you can use to integrate with the different products to create updates, but also get data. On third-party side, we have connectors to MS Teams, Jira, ServiceNow, Power Automate, and we have also introduced a generic connector where you can run any get, post, put, patch, or delete request based on your needs in case you want to integrate to a product where we don't have a default connector, an out-of-the-box connector. And then the last PowerPoint slide for the recap is I want to share the out-of-the-box templates we have for MS Teams, right? We have the major incident flow. For SMAX, we have an incident-to-incident, but also request-to-request template as part of the product. So you can start from those templates to build your integration and also to learn from those templates how an integration could be set up. For Service Manager, we have a couple of templates to load data from Service Manager into SMAX. For ArcSight SOAR one, but also for ALM, Octane, and Jira, we have templates for defect tracking, enhancement tracking, or pull the latest status updates from those systems back into SMAX. Before we now continue, are there any questions so far I should answer at this point in time, Steve? If not, okay, then I continue. And now let me share with you the goal for today, what I plan to do with you. I want to build in real life, no pre-configured things. Of course, I tested it, but I want to configure it with you together now from scratch, an integration between SMAX and Slack, leveraging the Slack REST API. And since we don't have a connector for Slack, I'm using the generic connector to build this integration. So the goal is to send a major incident notification into a Slack channel, and the message should look like this screenshot here with a nice classification, maybe with some tags, bold fonts, converted timestamps, a description, and a link to the record itself. And once the notification is sent to Slack, we also want then update the SMAX source record to write a short update into the history with the Slack response. So that's the goal I have for today. I hope you find this interesting, and I hope this is something where you can learn how integration engine is working, what capabilities we have. Of course, it will be a little technical today. It's not a feature session. It's a really technical thing with REST payloads and so on. But I think for using this integration engine, this is helpful. So what are we going to do to realize this goal? Those are the several steps we will perform together in a minute to execute this. So first we create an endpoint. And once we have the endpoint, we can go straight then in the integration engine to create a new integration. Once this is done, we configure a new scenario, and scenario is basically the integration logic towards Slack. Then I show you how you can test the scenario without invoking always a business rule from SMAX Studio. We have a workaround for this. I can introduce this to you. And then, of course, we finalize the integration, configure the business rule in SMAX Studio to trigger it, and then we test the integration in real by flagging an incident as a major incident, and then if all goes well, the incident should appear in the Slack channel. Okay, there are questions. Okay, maybe we answer this then. When will SMAX support article news, problem, and task records? This supports already. You can do that yourself, basically. At the moment, we don't have plans to provide out-of-the-box templates for those entities, but you can configure this yourself already. The integration engine allows those entities to share. Maybe task is a little tricky to make it visible in the task plan of a parent record. But articles, news, problems, and releases should be straightforward to implement. Okay, then let's stop the slideshow and go into the system. I'm here in my system, which I'm going to use to configure this integration. And as I just said, first we configure an endpoint. I made already here one, but let me show you what you need to do. You select REST executor, give it a name, an endpoint name, and then you configure click the configure button. Since Slack is a cloud-based solution, you can basically select agentless agent because we don't need on-premise bridge as a middleman because we can directly to it to connect to it. The authentication is no auth because when you read the Slack documentation, you will notice you need to send a special header with the bearer token you can find in your Slack configuration area, and then you copy or you configure a couple of data here. You need to configure the base URL. It's slack.com/API, quite straightforward. You need to enter the certificate details, which you can get basically when you go here, Slack, you can click here, and here you can then save your certificate to a file, save it as a CER file, as a text file, basically, that you can then copy the content of this file into your endpoint, as I did it here in this example, and then the secure connection can be established. Now, as I said, to connect to the Slack API, you need to provide a header, and this is an authorization header. And you type here, the key is authorization according to the documentation from Slack. It should be a header, not in the cookie. So you can differentiate here between header and cookie elements. We select header here, and then you have to type your bearer token and then the token from Slack. That is how you can connect and authenticate against Slack. No auth because we don't need to authenticate upfront before we send then maybe a payload to Slack. You just need to send this header every time you connect to Slack, even if it's GET request, a POST request, a PUT request. That's how you can configure it. For other tools, for SMAX, it's easy. Use the SMAX authentication type, basic authentication. I think everyone should be familiar with it. It's just username, password. And generic, it's an authentication type we introduced in the May release, which can allow you advanced configurations, pass headers and cookies, and you reuse them in subsequent calls for your integration. But in this case, as I said, we use no auth. Okay, let me save it. I don't use this endpoint. I use the previous one, but it's configured in the same way. Now we have this first step done. We configured our endpoint. And now let's go. Okay, it's expired. Okay, let me reopen it. Okay, now let's create a new integration here. Let's call it Slack. Connector, we use generic because you see we don't have an out-of-the-box Slack connector for a moment. And then we select our endpoint. I use the one with the real token I created before, which is Slack. I save it. And now I have my umbrella for all kind of integration into this Slack channel prepared. I need to set an integration user here to write back to SMAX to allow to update the source SMAX record or the read SMAX record where we want to get the data from. I type my personal credentials here, but you can also use an integration user. I activate the integration and save it. To have this done, now we achieved the second step already. We created our integration, and now we add the scenario. And the scenario is basically the where all the integration logic is implemented. So I click the add button. I say post message to Slack. So I can give it any name here. And you see now this scenario appears below the integration. So you can add many more scenarios now below the Slack integration in case you have other use cases to do. I set it to inbound for the moment. I'll explain you later what this means. Now you see I have a blank page, basically. I don't have anything configured here. So that means I need to start from scratch configuring my integration. And typically what I'm doing is a kind of best practice. I start always with a prepare data test step, but I rename this to default parameters. So this is typically a task I recommend to do for generic parameters you need to use throughout your integration, which are which you set at the beginning of your scenario, and then you can reuse that across the entire scenario in several places. Let me show you, and for this example, what I prepared here. So first, I renamed my task default parameters to give it a more meaningful name. I have to create an output. So every task produces an output here, and in this case, I call it parameters, my object name. And then I'm giving two keys here. First, I want to call it SMAX URL. And then I just copy here enter the URL to the current tenant, for example. So this is something you can do, right? You hardcode your document your a link to a SMAX tenant. You will see in the later step how we use that. And let me also explain the parameters used here. Payload entity type and payload entity ID. Those are parameters which are sent into this integration when you trigger an integration via Studio. So when you trigger an integration via Studio, payload entity type and payload entity ID contain basically the entity name, for example, incident, or the entity ID, for example, the incident ID. And you can use this data then to make this scenario more generic. That means you could trigger this scenario from an incident, from a request, but also from a problem, for example, and then use the same logic to post messages into Slack from different SMAX entities. Of course, you can also hard code this, right? Write instead payload entity type, the real entity name, incident, for example, but then of course it would only work for the incident. So this is one parameter I plan to do, and then another one we need a Slack channel ID. That's of course something you will find in Slack documentation. I prepared this here, and that's how I want to start. I create a default parameter task where those two parameters at the moment are configured. Let me save it for now. So we have done the first step, and you see now you can also have these parameters here in the right side panel to reuse them in further steps. So the next thing we need to do, we need to get the SMAX data from the record where we want to post into the Slack channel. To do that, I go to current SMAX action and I use the get record. So the get record is a simple get request into SMAX using the EMS API to get data from SMAX. Let me rename this again. Get record details to make it very user-friendly and easy to understand. And here, to make it generic, again, I type payload.entity type, right? It includes the entity name from where this integration is triggered from. For filters, I make a simple filter. I query based on the ID and then payload entity ID because this includes the record ID. This is passed over from Studio. For size, I only want one record, of course. For layout, I want all data, full layout, and also the related layout. Size run and skip, let's keep it 0 because we don't want to skip any record. And then again, I need to create an object. I call this object SMAX record because it contains the record where this integration was triggered from. And now the SMAX record is the umbrella, the object name, but we need to parse the SMAX response. So again, this action, the input, queries does a get request against SMAX. With the get request, we get a response, and we need now to parse the response to use the data we retrieved from this get request. Now, to do that, we can do following, and I explain in a moment what this means. I always put a key related properties, and then I use the JSON parser DSL. Response data includes the response from the GET request, and then I parse it according to the SMAX EMS payload. For example, entities, 0 related properties. Let me show you in Postman to easier compare that. We have entities, that's the root element, right? Entities, then it's an array. One record is returned, therefore we enter 0 as an array element. And then dot related properties. What that means now, it would assign to our object SMAX record dot related properties all the JSON here we have in this related properties object. That's what this JSON parser would do. So this SMAX record related properties contains the JSON object from related properties from our SMAX response. Similar for properties, this is just another object in the response. We do the same, we pass the response data, but this time entities, only one record is returned, right? Properties, so look in Postman, entities, array element, properties. So this object now in our integration, it would contain all of this, what I just marked in blue. So we have all the different property names then as part of this object. Okay, back into integration engine. I'm used to also make a kind of success statement here to make it easier in future for using it in condition. So I pass the meta completion status. If that's okay, I set success to yes, otherwise to no. That's up to you if you use the same principle, but I'm used to this now and continue with such a additional parameter. And again, all objects you did here, SMAX record outputs are now available on the right side for future usage. So now what we have done, we configure default parameters, we get SMAX record details. Now the next step is to prepare basically the payload we want to send to Slack. So, and to do that, I typically add another prepare data task. And here we can give it a nice name, prepare data for Slack. And then again, here I give it an object name. You can give it any name you want. I call it data. And then we add a different couple of properties. So now what do we want to show in Slack? Do you remember the PowerPoint I made at the beginning? So this is the message we want to post to Slack. So it means we need to prepare something for description, for creation time, priority, category, and service, and the title, the header, for example. So this is what we want to prepare now, that this appears properly in SMAX. And for creation time, for example, we don't want to send the SMAX milliseconds timestamp. We want to send a human readable timestamp. And for priority, we don't want to send the enum internal value. We want to send the user-friendly value. And for category, we want to show the concatenated category and not just a single one in SMAX. How to construct this JSON, then I will show you in a minute. So back in our integration, let's prepare now our data we need to do. We want to send, basically, let's put here description. And this is something we can do now. And what do I do here? To make a bold headline in Slack, like this description here, right? That's then Slack terminology. You need to put a star here around it. And then /n means a new line. And then in the new line, we send our SMAX properties description. But of course, you don't need to, you can also select that here from our SMAX record, right? You can put SMAX properties. And then you just need to you enter the property name we want to use here. So remember, SMAX properties contains all of this here from your response. Now, SMAX properties description uses this element here, this JSON key, and retrieves typically then the description from the ticket. That's how it works. So now I assign to data description the SMAX description from the record we basically want to send to Slack. Now, the next one is header I want to do. And for header, I simply do this, SMAX properties display label. Then the next one is priority, and here for priority we use a DSL and a more advanced setup. Let me show you what this means. Again, priority is just the bold text then in Slack. /n means new line. Oops. And then I use the DSL map. And map can convert values, key values into other values. For example, the input is SMAX properties priority, right? Priority, here we have it, low priority, for example, SMAX properties priority. And now I transform low priority to low, medium priority to medium, high priority to high, critical priority to critical. I think you understand this concept here, what map means. You can basically translate internal values in more user-friendly values or values your target system can handle, because not necessarily every system can understand the SMAX enum values. That's what I'm using here to send a user-friendly priority name into Slack. So that's this. Now let's configure the next one, creation time. We want to send the creation time into Slack. So similar principle. That's the text in Slack in bold. And here I use a format function, and format can convert the SMAX internal time millisecond timestamp into a user-friendly human readable timestamp. There are different options you can see in the help server what options exist. I used long here to have with time zone and all these details in the Slack channel then. That's creation time. Then let's say category, because we want to send the category, right? And here, let me explain what I'm doing. I use a if condition here because the category might not always be populated when you trigger Slack, and Slack always needs data. You cannot send an empty value into a block. So what I'm doing here, the first thing I check if SMAX, and this time related properties, you know, when you query with relation layout item, you get this related properties object in the response. And this related properties object has a category object, which has your category names, display label, the current one, level 1, level 2, parents, that you can build your hierarchy, right? So that's what I'm using here. First, I check if the display label is empty. And to do that, you can use this syntax here with a question mark. And this basically validates if category is part of the response payload. If not, it's undefined. So it's not available because SMAX does not return empty properties, empty values in the API. So that means I check if this value exists in my payload. So not undefined, right? And if it's not undefined, I again make my label in bold, and then I say SMAX record, this time related properties dot category, right? Dot level 1 parent. Then I make a backslash. So I make a string concatenation here, but just with plus sign. And then I say SMAX record related properties category display label. So I basically concatenate level 1 parent and display label in one string and then send it to Slack. If the category is empty, so not available, I just send an NA. So category and then an NA into Slack. That was this statement means. So you see in integration engine, you can do if else statements. You can also do else if statements to make to give you quite some flexibility. So the last one we need is the service, where we need to prepare something. And for service, I do similar. I make an if condition here. I take relate properties, which is that factor service display label if not defined. Similar principle then for category. It's just that I send here. I take from related properties display label from the service. That's what I'm doing here. So now that's basically all the data we want to send into Slack. So that means the data preparation step is done. Now let's save it first to make sure we have it captured. And now let's send it to Slack, right? Let's post it to Slack. To do that, let's add another rule. This time we pick one from the target, from our generic connector. And since Slack asks for needs a post request to send something to a channel, we select post request action here. Then let's rename it. Oops. So let's keep it short, send message. The URL here you find in the Slack documentation. So this, what you post here, is basically appended to the base URL you configure in your endpoint. So the full URL is slack.com/API/chat.postMessage. That's what we are using. And now we need to build our JSON payload. So basically, to send this message here, we need to build this payload here, all what you see on the right side. How to do that, I'll show you now. So we create a new property here. I explain in a moment what this means. So to post to a message to a channel, right, we need to have the channel key. And basically the channel we get from our default parameters here, right? That's where the channel ID where we have it configured. Now we need to create our complex JSON. Let me do a couple of those. I'll tell you in a minute what this exactly means. Okay, let me just explain you what I just did. Let's go to Slack, to this one. It starts with blocks, right? Blocks is an array. The array contains objects. So the first element is this object here. Header, text, text, type, right? Blocks.type, blocks.text, block.text.text, block.text.type, for example. That's what you need to do. That's what I did here. Blocks, first element in the blocks array, dot type is this. I set it to header. Blocks.text.type, blocks.text.type is this. I write plain text. And now block.text.text, this is the real data we want to pass over, which is our data header, right? This is what we prepared, the data we prepared in our data preparation step, which is just the one before this Slack send message. So you can typically select, drag and drop data.header here. So this, what I just configured here, builds this part so far. And to initiate complex JSON and to allow complex JSON, you need to put these greater than, lower than signs, characters around the JSON string, that then the integration engine will interpret this as a complex JSON and convert this syntax into such a syntax here in the backend. So now hopefully you understand these basics, and then let me finish the payload for the next elements here. To speed up a little bit, and then we are more or less done with our integration. So I set the next section, call it Markdown. That's the service I want to use. And next to the service, we want to display the category. So that means now I built now this section here, service category, which is this one here. This is what I just built in our integration engine, this part. So now let's continue with the next section. The next array element in the blocks array. And this basically is Slack JSON, right? The Markdown languages. That's not something we invented. You need to follow the SMAX Slack API to configure those cards. So we have another section here, another Markdown here, text. Now we send the creation time, drag and drop. Then let's have another markdown, and now we want to send the priority. Now with this, we built this section here in Slack. Okay, now the last section. Oh no, two more. Section markdown. This time we send the description. And then last but not least, we want also to add a link to the ticket. And here we use our SMAX URL. So now at the end, I built those two last sections, description and the view record section. Okay, now we have built our JSON payload. Unfortunately, the preview is not yet fully implemented, so the preview does not yet convert these complex JSON into the right preview structure. We are working on this. This will be fixed soon, but at the moment it simply shows it as simple key value pairs, which does not fit the reality. So the payload I built in the backend is converted to such a payload you see here in the Slack help page. So now, again, every task has an input and an output. We configured the input. Let's now configure the output. And here I call it Slack response, because that's what we will get after we send the post request. We get a response from Slack. Now I want to parse this response as well. As usual, I make my success key and then I parse the Slack response. So again, it's in response data. And in Slack, of course, that's what you need to learn when you study the SMAX API. In Slack, there's an OK key in your JSON response. And if this is false, it was not successful. If the OK is true or not false, then it was successful. So now we can also pass the error message to give more details. And we can also pass the message ID. So in case you want to reply to those messages, but I did not plan to implement this in this session. So now I pass the error and the TS. TS is the message ID, but you will notice that when you study the Slack API. Let's keep it like this for the Slack response. I click the save button. And now one last step I want to do is, in my introduction, I said we want also to post something back to the original SMAX record, basically. So let me check, create comment. Right, that's what we need to do. And here we use payload entity type to always exactly send the data back to the record where we call the integration engine with. So what do I do here now in my comment? So that's basically the comment I add to the SMAX discussion section. So I check if it was success, right? And if it's not undefined, and it was yes, I sent simply a text notification sent to Slack successfully, else notification to Slack failed, and I also put the error message here. I will demo this in a minute to you, how this can look like. So now, submitter, I forgot to find the submitter. Let me get the person record. This is the comments API I'm using here. And I need a valid username. Okay, that's the one. I need the ID here. I need to enter person ID. That's the API. And the other parameters are pre-filled already. Comment from, comment to. Of course, you can look here at the help, which out-of-box values are allowed. You can use any of those. For example, if you don't like agent, you can set a purpose and media as unknown. And here you see the real payload then, which is then sent to SMAX. And here we call it SMAX response, but I don't pass that any further. I just need to give an object name. That should be good enough for now. So now we have built our integration. We are done. Let's maybe just give it a friendly name. Okay, now how to test this without always configuring a business rule. This is something I learned when I built a lot of integrations. We can simulate this in a way to avoid always adding a business rule. So I do often just add another prepare data step just at the very beginning, and I call the object payload. And here I say payload entity ID, payload entity. So basically I simulate the data which is typically passed from Studio into the integration engine. So here I say incident, and here I take an example incident I want to pass over. And by this, right, payload, entity type, entity ID, this is what I'm using here. Payload, entity type, payload, entity ID. So basically now I set this data simulating what's typically sent from SMAX Studio into the integration engine. Now when I save it, give this also a name, test data, I can run my scenario now. Okay, then let's give it a try. Let me just open also the endpoint to show you how you can debug this, to see the status. Basically, we built the integration already. That's how it is, what you need to do. And if I didn't make any mistake now, it should create a message in Slack. Okay, endpoint, Slack, empty at the moment, nothing is sent yet. So let's now trigger it and see what happens. Let's check in Slack. Okay, here we are. That's the message. It works. Okay, the link is not nice. Let's improve that. But that's what we configured, and it works straight away. We have the service, we have the category concatenated, we have priority low, we have the timestamp when it was created, we have a description, and we have a headline and the link. Now let's look at the endpoints. What happened here? You see, this is all the steps we configured: test data, default parameters, and so on. All of this has its separate record here in this queue. And for example, if we now check the Slack send message, we see here's a request which was sent with the real payload. We also see the response which we retrieved from Slack. And in the output details, we see the parsed response, right? Error message null, of course, because there was no error. Success, yes. And message ID is a unique ID from Slack. So let's check. We passed, yeah, we passed basically this content here, and checked the OK key. And if the OK key is true, then it is successful. That's what happened in the backend. And then the other task was we also, yeah, send a comment to SMAX, but we don't pass this comment here. Okay, now one more thing. I also want to show you how errors can happen. How errors is then parsed. Let's change the channel name to an invalid one. Let's run this integration again. So now let's the success, because Slack always returns a 200 HTTP code. So SMAX will always only show failed if it's not 200. But you see now success, no. Error message, channel not found, right? That's what you can see. And now let's check in the incident. We were basically adding a comment to. It's this incident here, 13307. We should now see two messages. The first one was successfully sent, and the second one failed with the error channel not found. So just to give you a simple example, how you could leverage all those different actions to get data from SMAX, update kernel records from SMAX. And this does not just work for incident entity. The EMS API, EMS action works for any entity, any studio entity in SMAX. So I hope this is a good example. So now we have it tested, right? And we don't want just with test data, we also want to make it real. Let's disable this rule for now because we don't want the test data anymore. Let's change the channel back to a valid one. Okay, and one more thing to
Jan, can I pause you for a second?
Yes, of course.
So there are a couple questions, and I think people, what I'm sensing is there's a little confusion around what you were just doing in terms of testing the scenario versus executing it for real, which is the transition you're doing right now. So
yes, correct. Yes.
So what Jan has done is like hard-coded a particular incident to use to test the integration. That's this test data block of logic. He's now disabled it, and he's going to show how you'd want to actually trigger the integration in this scenario. So hopefully that clears up the difference there.
Yep.
If not, after we finish this section, just ask again. Thanks.
Yep. I did just this shortcut here to use the run scenario button basically without adding a studio role, but studio role we're adding now. So we disable the test data step, and now let's go to studio and integrate it end-to-end with the incident entity. So after applying changes, I want to send this notification when major incident. Okay, let me briefly change this. Steve, I will change it back after this demo. I use integration Slack. So basically my condition is if entity major incident is true and this flag has changed, I want to send a notification to Slack. That's what I configure now here in the incident entity, and this now should trigger from a real incident that the message is posted into Slack. Let me save this. Let's go into the incident. Let's pick another one. Oh, this is already a major incident. As well. So let me try and find one which does not have this flag set yet. Okay. Let's take this one. Okay, that's our category, that's our service, right? That's our description. And now let me check this flag here, which then should trigger the integration. Check in Slack. Oh, here, it's already here. You see, that's the incident I just marked as major incident, which then triggers the business rule in Studio, and then Studio calls the integration engine, so triggers the integration we configured together. So I hope this removes the confusion compared to the previous test step. And now back in the incident, we should have here a discussion. Let me refresh my screen. New entry that the message was successfully sent to Slack. Yeah, you see here, notification sent to Slack successfully. And basically, that's what I wanted to achieve in this session, to configure this together with you. It was technical, yes, but integrations are of technical nature, and I hope it was understandable what I did to give you an overview how you can also integrate to systems where we don't have a out-of-the-box connector to by just leveraging the generic connector. I'm going to finalize this integration, polish it a little bit, and then also the goal is to publish this on our marketplace, that you have also another template you could use. And right, to leverage this, once it's on the marketplace, you use the import button here, where you can then import as integrations as well. Endpoint is not included, but the integration engine scenario we configured here is then available. Then you could use this as your starting point to enhance or change it. Last but not least, all I've shown today is now in an improved documentation available in our doc portal. So if you go to integration and then integration engine, you see a new structure here, how to use it with different chapters, expression language, DSL, the complex JSON expressions, right? What I demoed to you, and also a bunch of how-tos. So we have a long list of how-tos already, how to do typical things in the integration engine to build your scenarios with real use cases, with real examples on how to configure certain things, like how to update a user option, right? How to upload attachments from another system to a SMAX record, and so on. Such how-tos are available here. So with this, I think let's use the last 8 minutes to answer questions, I would say. Steve?
Yeah, there's one question here that we haven't addressed yet. So is it possible to export the integration configuration from a test environment and import it into the production, or is it necessary to do it manually?
We have, since the May version, here's a dev to prod feature. You can see I click here on this 3 icons here, this icon, and then you can basically select export, and then you can select Slack or any integration you configured, right? You can also select which scenario you want to export. If you do that, you get a package here, similar as you know from standard SMAX dev to prod, and then you can load this package into your target tenant. But again, it includes this configuration here. It does not include the endpoints, because the endpoints is typically something where credentials and such things are configured, which are probably different in your target tenant. So the endpoint need to be manually configured, and you need to manually set the endpoint here again in this integration page. In case you have an endpoint with the same name already, we reconcile it automatically. But in case that endpoint does not exist with the same name, you need to select your new endpoint then here in this integration page. I hope this answered the question.
I think it did. Yep. All right. And so just so everybody knows, I did unmute the line, so you should be able to come off mute and ask a question. I do see another one posted here in the questions area. So I saw a retry option. I hope that will help us retrigger the action in case of failure. So can you cover a little bit about what the retry capabilities are?
Yeah, so, you know, we have the retry stuff here. I didn't show that because I'm not sure I can cover everything in the time we have.
Limited time.
Yes, but the retry policy is exactly for that purpose. You may get an error from Slack, right? Because it cannot connect because of various reasons. And then you can say, for example, here, if you can also use this, if response data, for example, this condition here, right, you could use here as well. Then you can then, if this condition basically evaluates to true, what you put here, you can then say a retry count, how often it should retry and in which interval. So maybe every 30, so it should try 5 times every 30 seconds. Right, that's what you can configure here, or you can set a longer interval in case you want to try for a longer period of time. But basically, when this 5 occurrences are reached, then it will stop the execution. And in Slack, you know, in this example, Slack always returns a 200 in case you send the wrong payload, for example. Not necessarily when you cannot connect, then of course you don't get a 200 HTTP code. But in case you send the wrong payload, it sends you also a 200 response, but then, you know, that's why I'm passing here. So it was not necessarily a success. So, but in some cases, in some systems, for Jira, for example, or other systems, ServiceNow, Octane, and so on, if you send the wrong payloads, you don't get a 200, you get an error message. And then SMAX, the integration engine, would automatically stop at the step where it failed. So by default, when you don't get the 200 response, it will stop where it failed. So if Slack does not return a 200, it will stop here. It will never execute the create comment action. It will also stop after your 5 retries. If none of your 5 retries succeeded, it will stop here. So in case you might want to make sure that subsequent tasks are always executed, we have a new feature here, and since May release, you have to go here to the settings page and you have to turn off this flag. Stop processing upon failure. So failure means if any other HTTP return code than 200 is received, it's a failure. If this is active by default, it will stop here, as I said. If you turn that off, it will do, of course, the retry as you configure that. But if the retry failed 5 times, it will then still continue with the next action to create, in this case, a comment in SMAX. And of course, you can use then conditions here when to start several tasks based on errors from previous tasks, where you can build a quite comprehensive logic to satisfy your needs during your integration. So in case it failed, right, you could maybe create an incident, instead create a comment to an existing record. That's all possible with this solution. But yeah, retry, you can activate it here. If you set it to true, it will always run, right? But you can put a condition here under which you want to retry. So I hope this clarified the question.
Great, thank you. All right, I don't see any other questions posted into the question manager that we haven't already addressed. We have 1 minute left, so we can take one more question live. If somebody wants to come off mute and ask a question, please do so. All right, I don't hear any takers, and I don't see any more questions. So thank you very much, Jan. That was very informative. I hope, audience, I hope you found it helpful as well. And thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend today. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.